Here's a wild pitch. The 1986 explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger was caused by a bad graph. This bad graph, in fact. It may seem pretty out there, but this is a take I heard many a time while studying physics and astronomy, usually in the context of a lesson on data visualization. Story goes, the engineers who built the Challenger knew exactly what was about to go wrong, but the graph they made to communicate that fact was just too shitty to convince anyone to stop the launch. Now, the truth is a little more complicated than that, but the figures created by those engineers still present a fascinating case study on how information is visually communicated. And just as importantly, how it's not. So today we're going to learn about the big spaceship explosion, yes, but we're also going to learn about data visualizations, how we process them, what makes some better than others, and why this is aesthetic terrorism.
Sid Redad شو من حل احباب وسيد الجواد شو من حل مشاد ومول الباس راني مشتاق الكاف.
So what do I even mean when I say data visualization? Broadly speaking, the representation of data through graphics like plots, charts, animations, etc. Is a table data visualization? Yes, but only in the way that a hot dog is a sandwich. I heard Seth Godin say, the purpose of a graph is to get someone to say, aha, and to see something the way you do, which I like as a definition because it underscores how data viz is fundamentally a form of communication. And in an increasingly data-driven world, it's a form of communication that's pretty damn critical. We all read graphs to make decisions in countless areas of life. To understand risks to our health, to make sense of our political landscape, to figure out our money things. And that's all very important, but exploding rockets are more interesting than COVID or finances, so our adventure through the world of data visualization will start there. In the first part of the video, we'll look into the example of the Challenger disaster, why it failed, what was in those notorious graphs, and how they could have maybe been improved upon. In part 2, we'll generalize by digging into how the human brain processes visual information. What features are we more or less sensitive to, and how does this influence our ability to interpret graphs? And finally, in part 3, we'll go through principles of good data visualization. For those of you who make graphs, this can serve as a list of best practices, and for those of you who read graphs, it's a guide on how to not get played by visual misinformation. We got something for everyone today. A video for the whole family. So first, let's look at what even happened. In an unnecessary homage to XKCD's Upgoer 5, I'm challenging myself to do this using only the 10,000 most frequently used words. This is a flying space car. Science people made it so they could go drop things off in space and also look at space things more closely. This part holds the people in it, this part holds the fuel to make the people holding part go, and these parts make the whole thing go extra super fast. These parts are very, very big, so they're made of many smaller pieces, and to make sure fuel doesn't come out from between the pieces on accident, they put 2 rubber rings in between each connection. And these rings are very important, because when the science people decided to launch their flying space car, there was a problem with some of them, and fuel came out from between the pieces on accident. The accidentally outside fuel caught fire, and only a minute after it left the ground, the flying space car blew up. With 7 people in it. Okay, this tone is getting weird. I'm switching back to normal speech. The 2 O-rings that caused the explosion failed because it was cold out, and the material they're made of loses resiliency at low temperatures. You'd think this is something engineers would be conscious of, and you'd be right, because they were. Literally the night before the launch, engineers from Morton Thiokol, the company that built the Challenger, got on a conference call with NASA to recommend that they delay the launch, specifically because they were worried it would be too cold for the O-rings to work properly. Up until that point, the record low temperature for a space shuttle launch was 53 degrees, and the predicted temperature for the Challenger's launch date was in the 20s. And yes, that's in Fahrenheit, because this is America, where we make bad choices. I'm so embarrassed by my country. But despite the Morton Thiokol engineers presenting plenty of data to support their argument, NASA officials ultimately decided that their concern was not worth delaying the launch for, and they proceeded as planned. And the exact thing the engineers tried to warn would happen, happened. Today, this decision is considered one of the biggest failures in the history of engineering, and there are many different ways people have tried to explain why it went as poorly as it did. Some center the tension between technical workers and bureaucrats, others are more concerned with groupthink and social conformity, but today, we are concerned, of course, with the angle of data visualization. Edward Tufte is an American professor of statistics, political science, and computer science who I believe pioneered the take that bad graphs caused the Challenger disaster. Which is saying something because he's considered one of the most influential figures in data visualization and has written several books on the topic. The Challenger argument comes from his book, Visual Explanations, and I'm going to walk you through it now. But to make his case with maximum drama, let's pretend you're the NASA big shot who has to make the launch decision, and I'm an engineer trying to convince you to delay it. We'll run the whole thing twice. First, I'll do it using the actual documentation from the Morton Thiokol engineers, then I'll do it again using Tufte's reimagined visualization of the exact same data. So first, the actual figures. Getting into character, breathe. We shouldn't launch tomorrow because the low temperature might be a problem for the O-rings. Here's the data to justify our argument. This is a table of past launches where O-rings were damaged by erosion, detailing the amount and location of each O-ring's damage. This is a diagram showing what O-ring failure looks like. This is a table of temperature and wind data for a subset of the launches that had O-ring erosion. This is a graph showing O-ring damage and temperatures for all rocket tests. And this is the same graph, but for the actual launches and not the tests. Each little pair of booster rocket cartoons encodes the O-ring temperatures, the location of any damaged O-rings, and the kind of damage taken. Got all that? In conclusion, it is my recommendation that you don't launch unless the temperature is at least 53 degrees. So tell me, NASA person who's making the decision about whether to launch this project with billions of dollars behind it that's already been delayed for months, do you think it's too cold to launch tomorrow? And scene. Okay, now let's do it again. But this time, instead of using any of the documents actually presented by the Morton Thiokol engineers, I'm going to use exactly one figure that Edward Tufte made. Ready? We shouldn't launch tomorrow because the low temperature might be a problem for the O-rings. Here's the data to justify our argument. I recommend that you don't launch unless the O-ring temperature is at least 53 degrees. So I'll ask again, do you think it's too cold to launch tomorrow? In case my choose-your-own-adventure rhetorical device didn't land, Tufte is making the argument with this figure that had the engineers who made these figures done a better job of visualizing the data, they would have been able to persuade NASA to delay the launch. In the 13 charts prepared for making the decision to launch, there is a scandalous discrepancy between the intellectual tasks at hand and the images created to serve those tasks. As analytical graphics, the displays failed to reveal a risk that was in fact present. As presentation graphics, the displays failed to persuade the government officials that a cold weather launch might be dangerous. In designing those displays, the chart makers didn't quite know what they were doing, and they were doing a lot of it. Pretty savage, honestly. Damn, Tufte. This take of a bad graph that led to people dying is one I'd seen a few times before reading Tufte's book. It's like a ghost story you tell a young scientist to scare them into being careful with figures. And ghost story it may be, because the more I looked into it, the less I found it convincing. For example, these figures, which are the ones people always use as the big impactful examples for the bad data viz argument, were actually produced after the launch for the investigation into the failure. Tufte is clear about that, but every other time I've seen this, the impression was of it being the deciding factor graph. And while a lot of the data in this figure was also in the charts that they did actually present on that fateful conference call, it's hard to say whether the engineers had access to all of this data beforehand, as some have argued that this was not the case. A paper whose author list included one of the Morton Thiokol whistleblowers who first raised the alarm about Challenger's potential O-ring problem argues that Tufte's analysis, and by extension all the urban legend storytelling around the bad graph that killed people, massively overstates the responsibility of the individual engineers who are doing the best they could with limited information. I'm a little skeptical of parts of this analysis. Like, a big point they make is that Tufte is comparing different kinds of temperature measurements, and so his visualization is misleading. But the temperature data he uses here are identical to those from the Challenger engineers' post-mortem figures. Still, after reading it, I can see how Tufte is maybe simplifying the technical aspects of what the engineers were trying to communicate and overestimating the access they had to data on short notice. But all these details of exactly who knew what when, while important, are not the thing that's compelling to me here. The compelling thing here is that two people used one dataset to communicate an answer to the exact same question. Is 29 degrees too cold to launch a space shuttle? And one of them made this figure, and one of them made that figure. And even though they technically show the exact same information, one of them immediately communicates why the Challenger shouldn't have been launched, and the other one looks like those coloring placemats kids get at diners. So while the legend isn't as clear-cut as I thought it was when I started researching this topic, I think Tufte's main thesis about the Challenger figures holds. There are right ways and wrong ways to show data. There are displays that reveal the truth and displays that do not. So this is right and this is wrong. The question now is, why? So the reason these two graphs can contain the exact same data, but only one of them obviously shows the critical piece of information that could have saved the lives of 7 people, is because the important thing in data visualizations isn't what's technically included, it's how brains perceive them. This might come as a surprise to some, but human vision is kind of fallible. When we look at something, we don't take in all of its details exactly as they are with equally high precision. Evolution has taught our brains to prioritize certain kinds of visual stimulus without us even being aware of it. So we don't experience a given scene objectively, we notice the important things. Remember that video where you're supposed to count the number of times a basketball is passed between people, and then at the end you find out that a gorilla walked by in the middle of it, and you wonder how you could have possibly not seen the gorilla because it's literally right there. Yeah, that's your brain just not registering clear visual information because you came to the task looking for something else. The way a visual target gets more attention paid to it if it's relevant to what you were already thinking about is an example of what's called pre-attentive processing. Pre-attentive processing, which Wikipedia describes as the subconscious accumulation of information from the environment, is the reason data visualization is such a powerful tool for communication. It's the part of our perception that happens without having to think. What guides our attention for the fraction of a second before we actually start paying attention to what we're looking at. And in addition to being driven by our goals and expectations, our pre-attentive processing is particularly sensitive to certain visual features. Here's an example I stole from a talk on this topic. This is a table of numbers, and I'm just gonna leave this up here for a few seconds and let you try to see if you can figure out the relationship between them. You can pause and take more time if you like. Figure it out yet? Now here's the same data visualized differently. And the fact that every single one of you instantly thought circle is your pre-attentive processing at work. And it told you something about this data that your on-purpose thinky number brain probably couldn't. At least not that fast. It's also very good at identifying certain kinds of difference. For example, which box has the red dot? You didn't exert any effort at all to answer this, right? That's because your pre-attentive processing can comprehend certain visual features in less than 200 milliseconds. You don't need time to think about it, you just look and know. So if you're interested in communicating visual data effectively, the best thing you can do is to make the critical information pre-attentively available. Or in other words, make the point you care about so immediately obvious that the viewer understands it without even having to think about it. When you look at Tufte's figure of the O-ring damage versus temperature, you immediately see this line, and whatever reasoning you do about the details happens after you've clearly identified this temperature range as having different outcomes than this one. And then when you start to pay attention and locate the predicted launch temperature on the figure, you immediately comprehend how it relates to the rest of the data. But this This you have to go one by one, read each little temperature record individually, check each little rocket figure for a damage marker, go back and look at the temperature of the other rocket that had damage, and by the time you've moved your attention from one silly little pair of rockets to another silly little pair of rockets, you've probably already forgotten the information on the first one, so really, you've already lost. There is nothing pre-attentively available here except, ooh, cute rockets, where are the crayons at so I can color them in while waiting for pancakes? Tufte's figure is better than the engineers, even though they present identical data, because it gives us a visual gist subconsciously. We don't need to sit and read and decipher and scrutinize to get a sense of how the data are distributed. No matter how much information you encode into tick marks and legends and axis labels, there's gonna be something in a figure that just hits before a person can think to process any of those other things. And this information that just hits is going to leave a much bigger impression than the detail-y bits that we have to more actively search for. So there's good data visualization, which leans into our pre-attentive processing to communicate effectively. There's mediocre data visualization, which fails to do that, and as a result, communicates less effectively. And then there's bad data visualization. Bad data visualization leverages pre-attentive processing the same way good data visualization does, but it does it for evil. And by that I mean lying by means of visual trickery. Let's look at some data visualizations that are bad on purpose. This is a graph of gun deaths in Florida from the 90s into the 2010s, with the year the Stand Your Ground law was enacted at a peak and a drop-off afterwards. Now, the big pre-attentive thing you notice here is the red, right? It's a technically valid way to represent data, and you can still very much see all the individual points, and the color does give you a very sharp contrast by which you see the shape of the overall curve, but you were probably so busy having the image of dripping blood evoked by their aesthetic choices to notice that the y-axis is literally reversed. Like they're showing you the graph upside down, just expecting you not to notice that gun deaths actually increased after the law was enacted. Which one would hope is an unreasonable expectation. Like, you want to think that they're underestimating people's ability to read graphs, but according to some research I'm going to talk more about later, this is actually a very effective way to trick people. In another super dark example, Purdue Pharma, the company generally credited with manufacturing the opioid epidemic, was sued for misleading doctors about the addictiveness of Oxycontin, and this figure was cited in the lawsuit for playing a key role in their deception. For reference, this is a kind of graph that shows how much of a drug is left in your blood however many hours after dosing, and apparently doctors who know how to read this kind of graph can quickly conclude how addictive a drug is by how quickly this line falls off. The steeper the drop-off, the worse the withdrawal. Looking back at Purdue's Oxycontin graph, the pre-attentively obvious thing here, shallow curvature, gives the immediate impression that the drug is not addictive. But upon closer inspection, you might notice that the y-axis is kind of funky. It's presented as a log scale, which is a very different thing than a linear scale. Log scales can be very useful in some instances, but unless you use them a lot, they're extremely unintuitive. The same data plotted on a linear scale would look like this, and if curve quickly drops off is your criteria for addictiveness, then this version is going to tell you that Oxycontin is addictive pre-attentively, while this version is going to make you work for that information. Okay, this one feels almost too embarrassingly and obviously bad to dignify as real data visualization, but this was sincerely shown in my government's Congress, so it is unfortunately fair game. In 2015, Utah Representative Jason Chaffetz sincerely showed this graph at a congressional hearing on Planned Parenthood funding. This is the second most offended I've ever been seeing someone present a graph in earnest. The numbers presented on this chart are all accurate. The two lines are on different unlabeled vertical scales, which is technically fair game since you can deduce that by comparing all these numbers. But the way it's arranged gives the pre-attentive impression that cancer screening and prevention services are anti-correlated with abortions. If you were to more honestly represent the data by putting both time series on the same y-axis, you'd get a much less compelling figure. Like the pair of Oxycontin graphs, both of these graphs show the exact same data, but one of them is exploiting your assumption that you won't go past your gut reading of it so it can lie to you. And that is the power of understanding pre-attentive processing. With all these examples of how visual tricks can hijack our cognition, I do feel like I should say that this isn't exactly a failing of our brains and eyes. Our imperfect visual processing, like our imperfect memory or cognition, isn't categorically bad, it's just optimized for specific things. We're not failed computers, we're complex beings that process immense amounts of information for a variety of purposes that an AI chatbot could never understand. Like so many other times where I have argued that a process is more subjective than we'd like to think, my point isn't thing subjective, so thing bad. It's thing subjective, so let's try to keep that in mind, huh? But I digress. I just don't want this whole section to come off as people are stupid because their eyeballs aren't cameras, because that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that understanding how we imperfectly interpret visual information is useful for both creating good data visualizations and also for recognizing poor or deceptive ones. So given all that, how can we become better at effectively presenting and discerningly receiving visual data? I do have an answer to that, but real quick, look at this graph I made of a bunch of things you could spend $3 on this month. Clearly, this one is the best choice. Guess you should go join my Patreon. Patreon is a platform where you can support my work through a membership, and in exchange for just a few dollars a month, you get access to a bunch of exclusive stuff that I don't share anywhere else. As a member, you can ask questions for office hours, which are Q&A style videos I record every few months, participate in our book club, where we read and discuss books on science, philosophy, and radical pedagogy, watch interviews I record with other creators, and occasionally receive updates on how the main channel videos are going. Which, by the way, members get to watch without ads. The members of my Patreon are the reason I can keep making these videos for all of you who get to watch them for free. And I am so deeply grateful to anyone who is, or has, or perhaps will support my work in this way. And would you look at that? These numbers about patron satisfaction are through the roof. And this is clearly a very scientific graph, so it must be true. I'm not trying to tell you how to live your life, but the numbers don't lie. If you're interested in joining, you can find out more at the link in the description. And with that, let's get back to our discussion of how to make graphs that are better than these. Data visualization is kind of like a magic trick. If you know what makes a clear and honest graph, you're going to be a lot more able to notice when a graph is misleading, whether due to incompetence or malice. For those of you who aren't going to be visualizing some data anytime soon, that's how I'd frame the principles I'm about to outline. As for the rest of you, feel free to take notes. Tufte wrote that good design brings absolute attention to data. So our first principle is about removing everything that takes any attention away from our point. Do you know what your point is? You're smart, I'm gonna assume you do. A good place to go from there is to consider whether a visualization is even necessary to get your point across. Sometimes an average or maybe a small table of numbers is perfectly adequate to communicate something important about data, and that's fine. Graphic visualizations are really only necessary when there's information you can see in the shape of the data that isn't apparent in aggregate statistics. Anscombe's quartet is a neat example of this. The data in these four figures all have almost identical aggregate statistics, but visually, you can see very different things going on. So if shapes are more informative than numbers, you make a graph. And then you have to ask yourself, what kind of graph do I use? I always thought this was kind of an ambiguous call to make, but then I found this study that tested different visual features to see which ones people can most accurately judge. And it answers that question for you. This ranking tells us that because humans can judge position and length more accurately than angle or area, people will be able to more easily compare data presented to them in, say, a bar chart than a pie chart. So a 0th order rule of thumb in deciding how to visually encode your data: start at the top of this list, and then if you need added complexity, move down only as necessary. And that's on pre-attentive processing. You also want to make your figures as visually simple as possible. Tufte explains this via the ideas of data to ink ratio, which is the fraction of the total ink in your figure that actually represents the data and would be, in the ideal case, equal to 1. And chart junk, which is unnecessary visual clutter as shown in this little animation that steps through some of the many things that can be removed from a figure without losing any meaning. Think back to our Challenger case study. This is a phenomenal example of low data to ink ratio and excessive chart junk. The strongest visual element here by a long shot is the little rocket outlines, and I feel like it's safe to say that both the engineers and NASA officials knew they were dealing with rockets, so having little drawings of them didn't add any new knowledge. Here's another neat list from another DataViz paper on common graph elements that are similarly cumbersome and should be avoided. Some of them may have legitimate uses sometimes, but the idea here is to only use any of these features if they uniquely add information. For readers of graphs, your takeaway here is to be skeptical of visuals that are doing the most. If there are weirdly specific visual elements in a chart, it might be trying to trick your pre-attentive processing into missing something important. Like, remember the Florida gun violence graph? All that red is a red flag. I'm not saying that any figure that takes creative liberties with visualization is made to deceive you, but let's just say that if there's a lot going on aesthetically, take it as your cue to pay closer attention to the details. Here's another banger line from Tufte's book. Numbers become evidence by being in relation to. A piece of data doesn't tell a story unless its visualization can answer the question, compared to what? Here's an example. Remember Tufte's reimagining of the O-ring temperature figure that makes it super clear that the Challenger shouldn't have been launched at 29 degrees? So there's actually a pretty similar figure that was produced for the Shuttle Commission report after the disaster that looks like this. It's almost the same data as Tufte's plot. You can see all the same instances of damage at the same temperatures, though they quantify damage using different metrics. But even though it's the same kind of graph, and they both show the critical information of the temperatures at which O-ring damage happens, the Shuttle Commission figure isn't nearly as compelling as Tufte's because of what it doesn't include. The shuttle launches where the O-rings weren't damaged. Yes, this graph shows you the temperature dependence of instances of damage, but only this graph shows you that at higher temperatures, the vast majority of launches were fine, and it's only at low temperatures where O-ring damage becomes a common problem. These numbers become evidence by being in relation to these ones. Besides thinking about which sets of data can be compared, the manner of comparison also matters. To see what I mean, consider this figure from that last DataViz paper. These three panels all show the same two sets of data, A and B. However, each one says something different. The two sets being highly correlated could theoretically be determined from figure A, but it's immediately apparent in figure C. And though you could pull out the distribution of each set from any of these figures, figure B makes the relative size of the two spreads instantly obvious. And like people making figures, those reading figures should always ask of data, in comparison to what? When you're presented with a graph that's trying to make an argument, what might be missing? A place where this comes up a lot in graphical misinformation is with people arguing that climate change doesn't exist by showing very carefully selected segments of data. In this example, someone is showing a legitimate trend of decreasing global temperatures from 2015 to 2022, which might look compelling until you compare it to the many, many years of data before. All of a sudden, the conclusion is very different. So be wary of figures that are only showing part of the story, and make a habit of wondering what additional information might put things in a different light. This video shows data collected by the Magellan space probe during its 1992 flyover of Venus. It's not an actual recording, rather it's an animation generated from radar data, and it misleadingly gave the public the impression that Venus is covered in dramatic geological features like mountains and canyons by means of exaggerating the vertical scale by a factor of 22.5. Turns out the landscape of Venus is a lot more similar to that of Kansas, but scaling by 22.5, Kansas would look like the Rockies. Exaggerating scales is one of the many ways that manipulation of axes massively impacts the impression a visualization makes. Another one is the exclusion of zero on an axis. This figure comes from yet another DataViz study that tested people's ability to interpret visualizations with misleading distortions, in this case, the distortion being a truncated axis. The data in both figures are the same, but one includes zero on its axis while the other does not. And it turns out that even though all the necessary information is encoded into both sets of axes, people's ability to accurately compare X and Y was highly dependent on which version they were shown, unsurprisingly being able to compare these values more accurately than these values. So in general, including zero on an axis is going to make comparisons more intuitive via our pre-attentive processing, But like with any rule, there are exceptions. Here's a cute little decision tree I found that can help identify said exceptions. The guy who made that also made one about whether or not to use a pie chart, which I wanted to mention because people who write about data visualizations have such strong feelings about pie charts. Like, I used to think pie charts were fine, but then I read a bunch of data viz papers, and now I understand that this is basically a hate crime. But back to our discussion of axes, another tip is to not use log scales ever. Unless you're working in a technical field that regularly uses log scales and you're making a graph that will be read by other people in your field, just don't use them. They're unintuitive, most people never learned how to read them, and those weird changing tick marks that help make them intelligible are just so messy. So no log scales. Besides the values you encode into an axis, the actual sizing of your axes matter too. Apparently, our ability to detect variation in the slope of a line is most accurate when the line is close to 45 degrees, and so it is ideal to set figure's aspect ratio such that any major lines in the data are around there. Like in these two figures showing the number of sunspots by year, a roughly equal aspect ratio gives you this dramatic spiky visual that doesn't say much besides the sunspot count being cyclical, but shrinking the y dimension until the slopes are about 45 degrees lets you see details in the patterns. Peaks rise faster than they fall off, and that's more true for large peaks than it is for small peaks. Scale your figures so it's easy for viewers to see what you actually care about. And for viewers, take all this as a list of things to check for. Does the axis not start at 0? Does it have a break? Is it reversed? Are the intervals inconsistent? Is there more than one axis? Again, all of these features could be present for appropriate reasons, but they can also manipulate your perceptions of data, so watch out for them.
كل step when and step.
Like with other elements, the first thing you have to ask about color is whether or not you even need it. It's low on the pre-attentive feature list, so if you can get data across otherwise, do that. But if you must use color, for the love of God, please don't use a rainbow color map. I know a lot of people like the rainbows, but a study found that cardiologists who regularly use rainbow color maps and are confident in their ability to interpret them made significantly more accurate diagnoses of arterial disease when looking at data with non-rainbow color maps. I get that they're fun, but they're just objectively hard to read. For one, different colors of the rainbow occupy different amounts of it. Like there's more red than there is violet, which makes the distances between what we recognize as distinct color points varied, and even the fact that we think linguistically of the rainbow as a set of discrete colors biases how we compare points along it. That's why the one place rainbow color maps are reasonable to use is with categorical data, where you want clear contrast between a set number of groups. This can be okay. This is never okay. If you are visualizing data that is ordered or changes continuously, meaning it falls somewhere on a line rather than into named categories, you want to use sequential color maps. These can be gradients from one hue to another, one lightness to another, or one saturation to another. Referring to our pre-attentive feature ranking from earlier, saturation trumps hue, but ideally, you'd use a combination of the three for maximum clarity. And if your data is diverging, meaning it has some significant middle point that warrants comparison from both sides, you'd want to use a diverging color map. Here's a really beautiful example of a diverging color map creating an extremely intuitive representation of elevation above and below sea level. And here's the same graph, but in rainbow. I know I already dumped on rainbow color maps, but this is just so bad. Why would somebody do this? Once you've figured out what your data demands of a color scheme, you'll also want to make sure the colors you're using are accessible. Color blindness is super common, and there are actually a couple different kinds of it. The most frequent is red-green color blindness, so avoiding red and green comparisons is pretty standard. But to check any color combination for contrast in the other kinds of color blindness as well, this is a really cool tool that does those transformations for you. I'm personally a fan of the IBM Colorblind Safe palette. I used a version of that and Matplotlib's plasma color map in my black hole paper, and honestly, that might be my favorite thing about it. My figures were so pretty. And while I'm talking about accessibility here, I want to briefly mention the possibility of non-visual data representations. Not everyone is sighted, so thinking of ways to communicate data through other senses is an important thing to do if we want representations to be accessible. Like, remember the blind astronomer in Contact who would listen for aliens on headphones? That's a real thing. Wanda Diaz-Merced is a blind Puerto Rican astronomer who's done incredible work with the sonification of astrophysical data. She's actually been able to identify features in sonified data that sighted astronomers didn't catch in the visual representations, which is so freaking cool. It's for sure worthwhile to develop diverse representation methods for the sake of including people with disabilities, don't get me wrong. But there's also probably a lot of potential for anyone to get a deeper understanding of data through multiple sensory channels. One time I went to this talk on the large-scale structure of the universe, and the speaker pulled out these 3D printed slices of the universe at different times in history. And I remember how viscerally I could feel the changes by just holding the different pieces in my hands. It doesn't feel like a stretch to imagine having insights from that experience that 2D representations couldn't recreate. So yeah, that's just a fun thing to think about, in addition to all the other fun things I've given you to think about.
Sid Redad.
So what can we say now about this infamous graph? Besides the fact that it looks like it belongs between a maze and a word search. Well, I certainly can't say in good faith that I think it's uniquely responsible for the Challenger exploding. It's an interesting story, very dramatic, very ironic, but at the end of the day, it does feel a little oversimplistic in explanation for a situation with many different moving parts. Honestly, I think I could make a whole other video from what I've read on it at this point. Like, why on earth was it NASA's MO to assume a launch will work unless you can prove it won't? Surely it should be the opposite. Like, what the fuck kind of devil-may-care attitude is that to have about shooting humans into space? But I'm getting distracted. Real-life complications aside, Tufte's analysis of this figure still offers a valuable lesson. Data isn't self-sufficient. It doesn't speak for itself, which may feel obvious to some, but there's this attitude common in technical fields that presenting cold hard facts is enough to ensure the rational transmission of objective knowledge. You know, just show people the evidence and they will see the truth. It's got the same energy as that thing where some professors believe that all it takes for a student to learn something is for them to hear it said in a lecture. Then they know the thing. That's what teaching is, right? Thing is, neither flavor of this attitude accounts for how people actually work. We have cognitive biases, we make assumptions, we miss details. And ignoring that doesn't somehow motivate us to do better. It's just ineffective communication. Because all communication, whether it's a conversation, a lesson, or a graph, isn't just about what you're saying. It's about the human being receiving it. For those who make graphs, the takeaway here is clear. You can't assume that just because the data is there, people will know how to interpret it. A good visualization acknowledges how our brains work, what we notice, what we miss, and what might mislead us, and designs accordingly. And for those of you who aren't huge nerds but still exist in a world where you occasionally have to read graphs, there's an equally important takeaway. Just because someone shows you a graph doesn't mean they're right. Data visualizations can be manipulated to mislead you in all sorts of ways. So if someone tells you the data speaks for itself, be skeptical, because data don't speak. We do. So whether we're designing graphs or reading them, let's try not to forget that there's always a person on the other side. Wait, am I really landing on data visualization is the friends you made along the way? I mean, that's a pretty cute conclusion. Wouldn't even be my weirdest thesis, really. Sure, let's go with that. Data visualization is the friends you made along the way. It's hilarious that I have a PhD.
Sid Redad.
Hello and welcome to the end of the video. This is where I thank you for watching it and ask you, if you can, to please do all the algorithmic things that help me out, like leaving a comment or subscribing to the channel. This is also where I'd usually respond to comments that viewers left on the previous video. I generally end each video with a discussion prompt for this reason. And last time I actually went way overboard and just made a whole video where I responded to viewer feedback. And I requested and received a lot of really interesting responses to my responses to the viewer criticisms. And my plan was to share those here. But honestly, if you watch the video, you know how much of an emotional draw that kind of work is. And I've been going through it this month, so I just didn't have it in me, and I'll be saving that for the next video. I don't want to get into the details of what's been going on, but if I were to share a vague piece of wisdom I've learned, join a tenants union before you think you need it. Just saying. It's good to know your rights. But I still want to offer something to you, all the viewers who have made it to the end of the video and are sitting through the crediting of my wonderful patrons. So I'm just gonna tell a funny story from my astronomer days that explains a joke I made in the video. So remember earlier when we looked at that horrible Planned Parenthood graph that one congressman had shown at some point? And I said, this is the second most offended I've ever been by someone showing a graph in earnest or something like that. So I'm sure some of you are wondering what's the most offended I've ever been at a graph. And it's a pretty funny story. So I was at this conference years ago, and I'm gonna be very vague about all the details because I don't want this to get back around to people. I was at this conference and I was sitting at this talk, and the speaker puts up a chart, like a figure. So he puts up this figure that's a scatter plot showing that the distribution of like instances of a particular kind of event have two clusters. And the y-axis is something like duration of the event, like the time. And then the x-axis just says eta, like the Greek character eta. With nothing else explaining it. So he puts up this figure and he says, when we plot the time versus eta of these events, we find two clear categories that we're going to use in whatever way. And immediately, of course, like 3 or 4 hands shot up. And the first one that gets called on asks the exact same question I and probably everybody else in that room is thinking, what's eta? So he asks what's eta, and the speaker goes, oh, it's just a useful parameter for categorization. And then somebody else raises their hand and follows up, sure, but what is it? Like, what is encoded into that parameter? And he's like, oh, we explained it in the paper, but for our purposes, it's not important. And a third person asks, just like, what physical parameters are factored into eta, and he just dismisses it. He's like, it's not important. We have these two distributions. That's what matters. And he just like goes on with his talk. Like we never find out what eta is. And you know, the whole talk is premised on these like two significant categories existing, and we literally don't even know what the categories are. Like, he shows us this figure as a premise of his talk, and we literally did not know what the data he was showing us was. And he just refused to tell us. And it's wild to see something like that, because I could have never gotten away with bullshit like that. Like, can you imagine if I went up and tried to give a talk and just refused to explain my axes? Like, this guy, again, not gonna be specific, but he's very high up leadership on a very significant international satellite collaboration that's like very central to the field right now. And it's just like, this is your guy? Homeboy doesn't even understand the point of a graph. That was just one of those moments that I mentally keep somewhere for any time that I might feel like I'm not capable or that I don't have whatever like knowledge or skill or ability to do something hard and physicsy. I remember people like this guy and how absurdly low the bar is. So yeah, that was the most offended I'd ever been by someone showing me a graph. I hope you've enjoyed this story, and I promise I will get back around to the responding to your responses, to my responses to your critiques, as soon as I have the emotional wherewithal to do something like that again. So yeah, bye.
Hey, could you step, wine and step?